Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you're joining from. My name is Kelly Hattel, and I'm a senior financial sector specialist at the Asian Development Bank, where I focus on access to finance across Southeast Asia, but with a particular focus on the Philippines through the Inclusive Finance Development Program, which I manage. It's an honor to be a moderator for this afternoon session. Prior to this current crisis we find ourselves in, the region was experiencing rapid innovation in many key markets and demonstrating exponential growth from the diversification of companies utilizing digital platforms. MSMEs, the backbone of every economy across Southeast Asia, were aware that even before this crisis, they would have to, at some point, adopt digital solutions in order to compete in the growing digital ecosystem. In parallel, financial sectors were embarking on or already navigating their own digital transformation journey, with fintech solutions emerging as key channels for accelerating access to and usage of financial services for a wide range of clients and markets. Through our own professional and personal lives, we've seen and experienced the devastating impact this pandemic has had on the economies in our region. The need to digitize commerce and finance has become ever more important for all participants in the ecosystem. It may well be the only way for many to survive through the pandemic and to recover. This afternoon's panel discussion will look at how private sector and government have responded to the challenges to increase access for all through fintech and e-commerce. Our expert panelists bring a wealth of experience and unique perspectives on how the pandemic has accelerated adoption of new approaches which can help drive and sustain the recovery process, and at the same time, establish strong platforms to grow strong digital economies. So I'm delighted to be moderating, and I am excited to introduce our key experts. And I thought that it would be nice to have each of them introduce themselves briefly. So I'd like to start first with Magnus Ekbom, the co-founder and chief strategy officer of the Lazada Group, just to introduce himself and his work experience briefly. Magnus?
Thank you, Kelly. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you, ADB, also for hosting this panel. So Magnus from Lazada. I have spent about 10 years in Southeast Asia, and I think a common theme throughout all the time that I have been here have been growth, transformation, and sort of a very, very exciting overall development. And I think we're looking at 2020, even if it feels to some extent a bit premature to reflect on something in terms of a crisis that we are still in the midst of, especially looking here in Southeast Asia to Indonesia, Philippines, and so on, and with a at least perilous situation in the neighboring countries. It is still, I think, very, very important to look forward and see also what this reset of our whole lives in many ways means for us going forward. So very excited to be here and looking forward to sharing some of our experiences, what we have learned so far, what we have observed, and how we think for the year ahead and the years beyond that.
Thank you, Magnus. Next, we have Ms. Deanna Morris, Program Management Officer with the United Nations SCAP. Please go ahead, Deanna, and you can share with us what SCAP stands for.
Great. Thanks so much, Kelly, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks also for ADB for hosting us. As mentioned, I'm Deanna Morris. I'm the Program Management Officer at United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. For those of you who don't know what UNESCAP is, we're the largest intergovernmental UN platform with 53 member states across Asia and the Pacific region. What I'm doing at SCAP, I'm overseeing the innovative financing component of a program that's called Catalyzing Women's Entrepreneurship. It's a 5-year multi-country program covering countries in ASEAN, such as Cambodia and Vietnam, but also South Asia and the Pacific as well. And it's a program that's funded with support from the Government of Canada. Just a bit on some of the work that we're doing. We do have several partnerships on innovative financing. One of them is a fintech challenge fund that we're working on with UNCDF, one of our other UN partners. We are also working on more traditional financing financial mechanisms such as guarantees and equity schemes. And we're also working with accelerators and incubators to support in digital transformation of women entrepreneurs, enterprises, and digital adoption as well. So I'm very excited to be part of the discussion today, and also looking forward to sharing some of the experiences that we have working with women in engaging in the digital economy.
Thank you, Deanna. Our next panelist I'd like to introduce is Ms. Ellen Joyce Suficiencia. She's officer in charge for the Center for Learning and Inclusion Advocacy at the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, which is the BSP, the Central Bank of the Philippines. Please go ahead, Joyce.
Hi, Kelly, and hi to everyone here on this call. As Kelly introduced, I'm Ellen Joyce Suficiencia, and I currently head the Center for Learning and Inclusion Advocacy of the BSP. The center was actually established in 2018 to drive BSP's financial inclusion and consumer protection agenda. We undertake policy and program initiatives to promote financial inclusion and innovations in financial services. Our office is also the secretariat of the Interagency Financial Inclusion Steering Committee that monitors and drives the implementation of the National Strategy for Financial Inclusion. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, Joyce. Next, we have Mr. JoJo Malolos, President and CEO of JG Digital Equity Ventures. He brings a wealth of experience from across the region. Welcome, JoJo. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon and good morning to everybody. Good afternoon to you, Kelly. Thank you for a nice introduction. Yes, I'm JoJo Malolos. I am the CEO of JG Digital Equity Ventures. It is a corporate VC or venture capital fund of John Gokongwei Group, which is one of the biggest conglomerates in the country. We are in the business of airlines, retail, hardware, supermarkets. We're in the business of property and mall development. We're also in the business of petrochemicals, banking. So we command a good span of impact on the Philippine economy. And setting up the JG Digital Equity Ventures Fund, it was one way of sustaining and supporting our digital transformation journey in the group that will allow us to look for innovations and see how that can impact the group, especially during this time when some of our businesses are obviously affected by COVID. As mentioned by Kelly, I'm also the CEO of another company in the JG group called Data Analytics Ventures Inc., which basically is a repository of all the consumer information across the group that allows us to incubate new businesses that will, again, support our transformation. And I've met some of the panelists here in some of my foray into financial inclusion, being the CEO of Cambodia's most successful fintech company called Wing Cambodia. And I'm very excited to share experiences of success in our digital transformation journey in the JG Group. Good afternoon to everybody.
Thank you, JoJo. And rounding out our panel is Ms. Isvary Sivalingam, Southeast Asia lead for the Better Than Cash Alliance of the UN Capital Development Fund. So please, Isvary, share with us your background briefly and the focus of the Alliance.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you to ADB for the invitation. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Isvary Sivalingam, and I'm the Southeast Asia lead at the Better Than Cash Alliance. We are a partnership of governments, companies, international organizations that accelerate the transition from cash to digital payments to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. The Alliance has 75 members. The majority are governments. And many of you know these governments have increasingly turned to digitization of payments in their battle against COVID-19, largely through emergency social transfers for the most vulnerable households. Digital payments, of course, also have a huge role to play in person-to-business payments, especially in the current crisis where we need to reduce physical contact and social distancing is critical. So in that sense, COVID-19 has really offered been a silver lining, I would say, for digital payments. We've seen a huge surge in overall volumes and values in the last 6 months in many of our member markets, including here in Southeast Asia. And we're really excited by the huge potential to continue this momentum as we work towards recovery. And most importantly, for digital payments to underpin a more inclusive digital economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isvary. And thank you to all the panelists again for joining us. So now what I would like to do is invite one of our panelists to provide sort of a scene setting for our discussion. And I'd like to invite Mr. Magnus Ekbom to share with us the regional overview of the digital economy revolution from the perspective of one of the largest commercial enterprises in the region, Lazada. Magnus, please go ahead.
Thank you, Kelly. Can I just confirm that you see my screen? Okay. Very good. So just as Kelly was mentioning, I wanted to share a few opening thoughts on, in some ways also the ongoing digital economy revolution that we have seen, not just over the last year, but also looking some 10 years back in time. And I think that when we think about where we are today in Southeast Asia, how we talk about the evolution of the digital and the internet economy as we know it, with its application for retail, for financial services, for the way we transport ourselves around cities and so on. I think it's also important to remember that only a few years back, we had a very, very different landscape. When we founded Lazada in 2012, the infrastructure and the ecosystem that we today, to some extent, take for granted, it was very, very nascent at the time. And I think to just also recognize how far we have come in only a very, very few years, I think is for me also always an important reflection to start with. But looking a little bit at Southeast Asia today, I think not to share so much news per se, I think that we are starting now to realize that this year is going to result in the first year of economic contraction that Southeast Asia has seen since the late 90s as a whole. And I think one of the reflections that we have really done from our side is that the nature of this crisis is very different, in the sense that when we look to 1998 or the financial crisis of 2008, we often looked at institutions taking the biggest hits, especially in the banking sector and so on. In 2020, we have a situation where the retail economy, or the longer tail of the economy as such, is really being hit the hardest. I think if you look namely at tourism and so on, it's sometimes easy to overlook or even forget about the fact that tourism is the largest, or one of the largest economic blocks we have across ASEAN, and it's in many sense it's no longer there the way we know it. And before we see a recovery, I think that is something for other people to perhaps opine on. But I think just looking at what it means for the economy as a whole, I think is something that cannot again be overestimated. But some of the other observations that you can also make, we have often talked about 2020. I think the word acceleration keeps coming back. And just to put a number on what that acceleration means, 310 million people being a part of or actively a part of the digital economy this year, that is a number that we previously thought we would get to somewhere 2025 or even beyond. And I think that we have now taken, we haven't just seen an acceleration as such, but it's really been a leap in terms of how, even more than what we saw before, internet and the everything that the internet brings to both business as well as consumers have really meant for Southeast Asia in 2020. Also, when we look at what consumers buy and sort of how we use online channels, if you look at groceries and grocery retailing as one example, it's a category, should we say, a cluster in the economy that goes across several $100 billion of value every year. And this is an industry that for the first time we have really seen an acceptance to also use online channels for your daily needs to buy groceries and to get them either delivered or through other means. into the online economy in a way that simply wasn't there before. And I think this shift, both in terms of the categories that now are moving online, as well as the consumers and the profile of them, because we have often seen online as a bit of a skew towards a younger demographics in terms of age being somewhere between 18 to early 30s as a core consumer group. But we are now seeing also segments of consumers that are coming online that previously did not consider online as a go-to channel in any way. And that brings new challenges, but also many new opportunities, both for businesses and governments alike. Looking at some of the things that we have seen over the past 6 to 9 months in our business. And I think as Kelly was saying in the beginning, right, that SMEs and MSMEs are the backbone of the economies in ASEAN and beyond. And given that we have many companies that if you look again at the reflection I was making before and just how much has happened over the past few years, I think it is important to remember that to adopt online tools and to start leveraging, if it's either e-commerce or whatever else it might be, this is a very, very big leap. That it's not just something that happens overnight, just because this is something that all of a sudden becomes a basic necessity. The importance of making it easy for SMEs to go online, the importance of education, the importance of training and ensuring that companies really are handheld throughout this process and this journey, I think is an extremely important takeaway from our side. That we talk a lot about digitalization of our economy as a positive, but it also presents tremendous everyday challenges for SMEs, irrespective of their size. When it comes to one of the key challenges that quite early on became evident is that of what we call a cash crunch, or simply many SMEs running out of money, given that you have inventory being built up that didn't turn as was expected, given how abruptly the crisis came and hit the broader economy. And I think this is something that I'm very also curious to hear from the fellow panelists with regards to the learnings from what we saw starting in March, April, and June. Because when we also in discussions with many government officials and various institutions, what becomes quite evident is that the infrastructure that is in place for either governments or private financial institutions to provide support to SMEs and MSMEs, the infrastructure as such is not necessarily in place in terms of how do we do verification of identities, how do we even know who or like what SMEs we have across the economy, how big they are, how do we get in touch with them and so on. Simple things as having emails, addresses and phone numbers all of a sudden became a very practical but very, very real impediment to many of the stimulus and economic support efforts that we had a desire to put into the real economy. But also some stories of, should we say, fantastic initiatives and entrepreneurship from the ground. I was talking a bit about the grocery category or the grocery retail sector of fresh produce and so on. I think we have many, if we call them sunshine stories, where farmers of different sizes who previously saw their markets as the wet markets nearby or just their immediate vicinity. I think this is an area where online and e-commerce could really add value and make the addressable markets for farmers much, much bigger and much, much more accessible than it was before. And I think that this is something that it's not just a trend, or it's not just something that we see as a temporary blip, but really something that fundamentally can transform the way we look at grocery and the way we look at farming. And I think also in the context of exports for Southeast Asia, which will be an increasingly important topic going forward, even though the total market size for fresh produce and fruit may still be relatively limited from an export point of view today, it's something where we see big opportunities going forward. Also, just a few to add some numbers and to provide a few reflections. First, when it comes to private equity, venture capital funds in the region, I think we have seen a tremendous inflow over the past 10 years in terms of the sheer amount of invested capital that has reached predominantly the internet sector and the tech sector. And if we look at 72% that continues to flow into the tech sector in 2020, I wouldn't say that is a good or a bad thing. I think this is more a matter of fact that the tech sector, the way we know it, is taking a disproportionate amount of the venture capital available. And I think the takeaway from our side here is that there are so many more industries and also types of companies that need capital and that can make really, really good use of it, perhaps even better than many companies in the tech sector. And I think that this is a reflection and takeaway where we really hope that more companies can get access to the tremendous, also global interest in being exposed from an investment perspective to Southeast Asia and Southeast Asia's very, very fast growing middle class and consuming sector. The second reflection, when we say that 67% of retailers in APAC struggle to integrate AI into their business models. AI, big data, many of these terms that we have become sort of commonplace and everyday, it's good, it's important, it presents tremendous opportunities, but it's also, I think, very, very important to remember that the everyday realities of businesses is not necessarily digital just because we are going through a digitalization process. And to remember that everyday struggles in terms of how and what it takes to transform a business, the way we run it, but also to transform our organizations and our ability to make use of technology, I think is a challenge that we should not underestimate. And the importance of providing education in both for companies as well as for individuals, I think is a challenge that we should really not underestimate. When it comes to consumer behavior and how our consumers engage with apps and so on, live streaming, I think, is something we quote here a number from China and the role that live streaming has played in China. It is an emerging way for SMEs to engage with end consumers in Southeast Asia. I think this is a big focus area for Lazada and for many other companies in the e-commerce sector. And we do believe that these technologies present tremendously exciting opportunities for companies to showcase their products, to engage with the market in a way that previously was not accessible to them. And we believe that it doesn't stop with live streaming. There are many, many more technologies that are waiting around the corner. And what I really hope is that when we look at 2020 as a bit of a reset, that we don't just go back to investing in the technologies of yesterday, but really that we invest in the technologies of tomorrow. And we take a bit of a blank piece of paper approach when we look at how we, in the best way, use technology and build companies for the future. As a couple of final observations, there is nothing normal about the new normal. I think that is indeed something that we believe is very, very important to remember. I mentioned here the term supply shock in the sense that we have brands and SMEs that are coming online at an unprecedented pace. And this is fundamentally very, very good and a very, very positive trend. But again, that we do not underestimate the challenges that comes with that, and that we don't create a digital divide that is larger than what was already the case in the years that has just gone by. I think that we really take that challenge seriously. I think is tremendously important, and also that we look at the sheer challenge of making these new skills that are necessary accessible to the masses. I think this is something where both governments and the private sector need to work together. We are very much from our side looking forward to working together, and this is a challenge for all of us to tackle. As two final observations, when it comes to the financial market and sort of how we look at the access to financial services, I've quoted three numbers here: 1 trillion, 1 trillion, and 5x. 1 trillion being the size of the retail market across our region in 2025 and beyond. I think just as a reminder of the sheer size of the opportunity that Southeast Asia presents for investors and for companies that are looking to serve the customers of this fantastic region in new and innovative ways. Secondly, 1 trillion, the value estimated in 2025 for digital payments. I think this is again something that we are still in very, very early days when it comes to the adoption of digital financial services. We are, I would say, barely scratching the surface. This is an area where established banks, startups, and governments together need to find ways, both in terms of how we create a safe environment for consumers, how we create, we ease the barriers. I spoke briefly earlier about the importance of digital identities and how we make that, or we take away that barrier from the financial services market as much as possible, but also that we take this topic seriously in the sense that we need to have a good and sound regulatory environment. This is not about being for or against regulation. You can argue in many different directions. We need to have a sound ecosystem that is sound over time. I think that is really the key takeaway from us, especially in the last 5X year, which is about the demand for SME financing or lending to small and medium-sized companies. This is a number that we really believe will grow over the next 5 years, especially as supply chains start to get upgraded. Many of the SMEs are still quite far down in the supply chain as such. And as they grow their businesses, as they upgrade the quality of their supply chains, this is something where trade financing with online or enabled by online solutions and technology, both can be de-risked, but also made more accessible. And I think the final point I wanted to make, no crisis comes twice. I think that when you look at the challenges that we have in 2020, not just in terms of the sheer magnitude of the health crisis, but that we remember that we don't have the same situation that we had in 98, in 2008, or in other previous crises. This is a very, very different situation. And again, especially the for me, so important fact that we don't have an institutional problem, we have a long tail problem, and that we really look at the practical problems and the challenges that we need to tackle together to support SMEs in the best way possible. The SMEs are indeed very much the engine of the economy. Without the SMEs, Southeast Asia can't bounce back. I think if we get it right, the next 10 years in our region will be some of the most exciting we have seen so far. I think that there's never been a better time to start new companies. There's never been a better time to invest in new technologies. And I think that we are looking forward to play an important role in that evolution. And we really see Southeast Asia not just as our home for Lazada, but also as one of the most exciting places to be anywhere in the world in 2020. Thank you so much, Kelly.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Magnus. I appreciate that you ended on an optimistic note with your presentation. There's a lot to unpack, and I think that I really appreciated the points that you made, because I think with the panelists that we have here this afternoon, they each can speak to different aspects of what you shared. I mean, particularly, I think what I found interesting is this idea of, that we've accelerated and reached many of the targets that we'd set for 5 years ahead, but perhaps don't have the necessary infrastructure in place to help really effectively sustain the achievement of those targets. And this issue of a digital divide, I think this is also a very important issue, especially if we're speaking as development partners, ADB and UNCDF. So I'd appreciate to hear your thoughts on that, how we cross over this digital divide or make sure that it doesn't become wider. Also this, the critical lack of capital, how we address that issue for businesses that are suddenly faced without needed funds. And then of course, the need for having a good, strong regulatory environment. And, what I've seen from my perspective is we've been working on a lot of these issues and addressing them, but all of a sudden they're just is becoming more important. And we, in some ways, I wish we had been able to achieve things sooner than now, but we're faced with the situation that we are. And I would like to also keep an optimistic viewpoint. But now what I'd like to do is move on to our panelists. And linking it, to what Magnus shared with his presentation, but also, of course, bringing in your own experience. So I first would like to turn to Deanna Morris from UNESCAP. Deanna, based on your experience leading the Catalyzing Women's Entrepreneurship program that you mentioned in your introduction, I'm especially interested to understand if you've seen any changes in the participation in the digital economy, particularly for women, because your program has a gender dimension. Have women-led businesses been more or less able to adapt? Does the infrastructure have any are they more disadvantaged, or what have you seen, especially since the beginning of the year and in light of the pandemic?
Thanks so much, Kelly. And also, I have to say, Magnus's presentation, I think, really hit the nail on the head with a lot of things that we're also seeing in the market right now, and particularly with our fintech partners. I would say, to answer your question, there's not one answer I can give. I would say it's really a mixed picture by country and by sector. And, as I mentioned, we're working across a variety of countries, not only in ASEAN, but also in Bangladesh and Cambodia and also Samoa. We recently did a rapid COVID-19 assessment on the impact of women entrepreneurs, particularly in Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Samoa. And as I mentioned, the findings were a bit mixed, but there were also very consistent constraints, I would say, and commonalities across the board. Across the countries, what we've seen is that large transition, particularly when it comes to e-commerce activities. On both sides, on the demand side and the supply side, we've seen that transition and adoption of e-commerce, online payments, and merchant payments. But this is not to say that we've gone completely digital. Many customers have made the digital switch to online purchases, but cash is still king in many of these economies. And cash on delivery is an option that we're seeing predominantly used, as well as the digital payments that's making this transition. And I think one of the things that really stood out to me, and I think Magnus also mentioned this in his presentation, is that, what's happened as a result of COVID has really created an opportunity for e-commerce, but also the acceleration of the ecosystem overall. And it's been incredibly quick, much quicker than any of us had expected. And I think COVID has really been that disruption that creates the use case for this transition to digital. And as we know in the development community, behavior change is what we're all working on, right? Particularly in access to finance. I think that this opportunity has been created for this behavior change, and we're seeing that play out in the market. In terms of businesses' ability to adapt, what we're seeing is that businesses who have the ability or were already on e-commerce platforms were really able to thrive in the new normal. Some of the sectors were also able to reposition quite quickly. Magnus also mentioned this in his, he was talking about the farming sector. We've also seen that in the food services sector, where there are, existing digital platforms. It did allow for easier onboarding to existing platforms. However, it's not the case for all entrepreneurs, and depending on the type of business and the repositioning needs, it can be very prohibitive, especially when we're talking about the cash crunch that many of the businesses faced during lockdown. It is costly sometimes to digitize your business, and it doesn't happen overnight. Some of the persisting issues, I would say, particularly for women participating both in the digital economy and as women entrepreneurs, really have been exacerbated during this time. As we know, in terms of digital, women typically are less tech savvy, and this is predominantly due to educational and socio-cultural norms. This has been a major impact, I would say, in the ability to adapt at this time. It's a major shift towards digital. It's a very stressful time. Financing is stressful enough. And then moving your entire business to a digital form, it can be prohibitive. Informality of women entrepreneurs is another issue. You know, in Cambodia, we see 62% of micro entrepreneurs are women, which is great, but many of them are in the informal sector. And you can see that divide too, because 26% of SMEs, more formalized, are only women. So that's a big jump from 62% to 26%. And informality has really prevented, you know, access to government entrepreneur support systems. And Magnus also mentioned this in his presentation, you know, having addresses, having the information of the different individuals to be able to receive that support when you're not necessarily a registered formal business, that's a huge gap. And I'll just give a few examples from some of our work. And as I mentioned, you know, it's not one way or the other. In Cambodia, what we saw was the challenges for women entrepreneurs. One of the women that we interviewed was a soap producer, and she was producing products for hotels. Informal, very small business, cash crunch, not able to really reposition the business and having to look at other options. On the other hand, and I'll take an example just from Bangladesh because it's one of our kind of a good case study, was one of the fintech operators that we're working with. And essentially, it's kind of an Uberized beauty care service. Of course, you know, during the lockdowns, those services ended. But because it was an existing platform, they were able to really reposition the business model quite quickly. And those women who were previously providing beauty care services were now providing milk and basic supplies, sanitation, masks. And they also repositioned the business to provide free mental health support for the community, which is, you know, part of this whole building back better that we talk about with the UN. So it was very interesting to see these two different challenges in the market, you know, the ability to adapt, but also the challenges that women entrepreneurs continue to face in that digitization divide. One of the things I would say just to conclude here is, you know, how are we working to support in some of these challenges? We do have our existing Women MSME FinTech Innovation Fund with UNCDF that I had mentioned. We're working with our FinTech partners to provide further funding in some cases to reposition their business models, also linking them with the providers that are needed to kind of support that repositioning. We're also working on the advocacy front. I mentioned the informality and the need to transition to more formalization. That's looking at one-stop shop registration, incentives for registration, and advocacy efforts around that with our government counterparts. And then the final point I'd like to make is some of the work that we have coming up, and this is, I'm quite excited about this. We're working with UNCDF, Visa, and FMO, the Dutch Development Bank, to launch a Women's Enterprise Recovery Fund. And the aim of that fund is really to support the digital and fintech solutions for women entrepreneurs to reposition and also recover during this time. So I'll end there, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Deanna. I appreciate your perspective on how women have been most especially impacted, and you know, it highlights the importance of data, having data to understand the differences, and then helping to identify particular solutions that can support the gaps that we find. The next panelist I'd like to go to is Joyce from the BSP. You know, the presentation from Magnus gave some interesting examples of adaptation in the midst of crisis. Last week, the BSP launched the Digital Payments Transformation Roadmap 2020 to 2023, laying out the bank's plans for advancing a digital payments ecosystem. You know, I know that from working with the BSP very closely on particularly financial inclusion and access to finance, that these targets also are being accelerated based on the current state of the response to the pandemic. I'm curious, what are the key pillars of the strategy? And how has the pandemic affected this strategy and its implementation? Which parts are accelerating faster than expected, and which parts are, I think, becoming more challenging, particularly if we're looking at this digital divide, the need for strong infrastructure, and connectivity, which is also an issue we haven't really discussed too much yet. Joyce, please.
Yeah, thank you again, Kelly. So as you mentioned, the BSP last week formally launched the 3-year digital payments transformation roadmap in support of our bold targets for financial inclusion and digital payments. And you've probably read the governor's public announcements of our 2023 targets. We want to onboard 70% of adult Filipinos to an account and bring digital payment transaction volume to 50%. So that's quite a huge jump from our current level. And you asked about how the pandemic has impacted our vision and this transformation roadmap. And from where I stand, it's really highlighting the digital imperatives that we need to focus on in this digital payments transformation roadmap. And I really look at the DPTR as essentially a contract of the BSP with the public, a commitment to ensure that the digital innovations are harnessed for optimal benefit of the broader swath of the population. So the DPTR actually takes into account the imperatives that we see to ensure these gains to transition to a digital economy that has been accelerated by the pandemic are distributed evenly. And these imperatives include the digital ID, of course, which I'm happy to report is coming nicely along. The Philippine Statistics Authority, which is the primary implementing agency of the PhilSys, that's the digital ID of the Philippines, is targeting to register 5 million individuals from low-income households within the year. And PhilSys is envisioned to be a game changer for financial inclusion, not only because it will provide every Filipino a digital ID that can be accepted on its own for any financial transactions, but also because it will significantly reduce the cost of client onboarding by banks, which will make it viable even for bigger banks to go into previously untapped low-income markets. And the other imperative is, of course, digital connectivity. And you mentioned this earlier. And the BSP is looking at supporting, advocating for policy reforms, ICT policy reforms, to ensure, to fast-track infrastructure, internet infrastructure development in underserved areas. And we now have the Financial Inclusion Steering Committee actually is endorsing for the Office of the President, to the Office of the President, an executive order which aims to liberalize access to satellite technology to bring broadband connectivity in underserved areas and islands across the country. And another digital imperative that's tackled in the roadmap is, of course, having an innovation enabling, and I would say innovation shaping regulations. BSP's proposed digital banking licensing framework, we've already exposed the second version of the draft of this, and as well as the open banking are two regulatory initiatives worth highlighting. The creation of the digital banking license is envisioned to attract innovative market players who have a strong digital play and can inject much needed dynamism in the digital finance space in the country that will benefit ultimately, of course, the consumers and our small business owners. Our goal for open banking, and I think some countries and some regulators would call this open data, is to shape an ecosystem that facilitates responsible sharing of customer transaction data to unlock access to a suite of well-designed financial services that can really improve the welfare of the users. We envision our banks and other financial institutions not only able but also compelled to deliver data-informed products that are hyper-tailored to the needs and context of the consumers, with the end goal, of course, of delivering optimum customer value. In the future, for instance, we see a small business owner with no credit history, no collateral, able to access a tailored loan product from a bank based on his cash flow based on his payment transactions and other activities in e-commerce or other digital platforms. We of course recognize that this future will not happen overnight, but we in the BSP are committed to take the necessary steps toward achieving this envisioned state. That's it from me, Kelly, for now.
Thank you, Joyce. I think it's very exciting to have this this roadmap, and it's addressing really what are the critical drivers for supporting the digitization, a digital economy in the Philippines, and it's a pleasure to work with you on a number of those pillars, particularly with PhilSys and also with the increasing access to finance for financial inclusion. Next, I would like to turn to JoJo. A year ago, when you took on your role as CEO of JG Digital Equity Ventures, your goal was to use data analytics to incubate and launch new and relevant digital businesses to enhance the lives of the Filipino consumer. So, how has COVID shaped your strategy? And have you seen any differences in sort of the onboarding of new clients and customers compared to the experience of Lazada that Magnus shared? Or do you have some interesting different perspective to share? Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. I think I'd like to start by saying that in this venture capital objective or venture capital community, we've always aimed to become game changers, right? So we look for companies that will change the rules of the game, create new plays. But what COVID did was they changed what we are changing, right? So this is how do you come up with a game changer to the game changer, right? So, and I guess the answer to that is really data. And in the earlier presentation or panel where Nadim talked about the value of data, he's not talking about data as the oil now. He's talking about data as a utility. It becomes, like any staple food wherein, you have to find a way by which you can use it on a day-to-day basis because of everything that's happening. So what COVID did to our strategy, that previous strategy, was just make clear on how we can really execute it. The JG group spans businesses that are affected by COVID. We have the airline business. Magnus mentioned about retail. We have the retail business. Somebody mentioned about property development. We have 52 malls in this country. We also have a digital magazine, new media business. We have a bank. So in more shape than anybody else, this has been greatly affected, and we feel the pain of a game changing impact of COVID. Why? Because the group exists to have an impact on the economy of the country. The group exists with businesses that will affect the lives of millions of people. We have thousands and thousands of MSMEs which we're enabling and helping out in our businesses. So this is where we would like to focus all of our digital initiatives, and this is where JG Digital Equity Ventures look to achieve its objective of incubating or developing startups that has innovations that will clearly have an impact on managing this game changer and then turning it around, right? So the COVID situation has brought us to understand much better, in fact, the behavior of our customers and how they define what Magnus was calling there's nothing normal in the new normal, right? So, you take a look at our customers who go offline to go to our, hundreds and hundreds of supermarkets. How is their new behavior? You go to our bank account holders who are very, very much used to using our hundreds of branches. You take a look at our Cebu Pacific, passengers, now that there's not much of a travel, how do they go about going to their lives? So what we have done in the JG group is really by focusing on our ecosystem of huge businesses, and look at it as a mini Philippine ecosystem, we're able to focus our digital efforts into driving and sustaining the recovery process. Maybe, just maybe, when we implement something, when we test and learn, when we try out new things that will probably allow us to recover from this, maybe if we apply that on the general Philippine economic ecosystem, it will also work, right? So, for example, the use of data allowed us to really use innovation that will cater to the new normal behavior of people. For example, we have invested in a company, in a B2B company that basically is the e-commerce platform of sari-sari stores, of micro-entrepreneurs, right? So we allow them to purchase goods digitally from our supermarkets. But more than that, we're also able to give them access to FMCGs that will allow them to manage their prices better and basically augment their business. So the objective is to augment their business, not to basically, the objective is also to augment their business, not just basically get them through this phase, right? So we also invested in an e-commerce aggregator that allowed us to bring, the likes of Lazada, the likes of Shopee into our customers by giving them choices. We also have worked with our bank, and we've worked with our bank with the BSP, wherein we're able to bring the services to the base of the pyramid through the social amelioration program of DSWD by allowing these thousands and thousands of new account holders to experience cash out via using a cardless ATM. So we think that the important output we're seeing is not just our ability to match massive innovations and use them in their ecosystem, but the fact is that our own little economic sandbox in the JG ecosystem, we're able to establish, deploy, and sustain strong platforms that we are certain will help manage us to recovery and also allow us to grow and sustain all our efforts. This is consistent with what was presented by Magnus. I guess the digital divide is still an issue. I guess connectivity is still an issue. So we are also looking at investing in companies that probably will improve the cost of broadband in this country, or make sure that it's equitably distributed to these customers who's probably not representative of the gains that we're having currently. Much of those at the base of the pyramid probably are not contributing to this surge in digital transactions, but we have to find ways by which we can also bring it to them. Thank you.
Thank you, JoJo. Yeah, I think that's interesting that there will be a necessary shift of some funds that were planned for other purposes, but we need to address some of the urgent needs, especially with regards to connectivity, and make sure that everyone is included in the recovery process. I'd like to now turn to Isvary with the Better Than Cash Alliance. The Alliance recently looked at some of the major risks for digital financial transfers during COVID-19. So we've talked a lot about the benefits, we've talked about changes in growth in numbers and new entries and those who've fallen aside, but we haven't really talked so much about consumer protection issues. And so if you could please talk about some of the risks of these digital financial transfers and how some of them could be addressed.
Thank you, Kelly. So I think you very rightly said why we need to be talking about risks, right? Because it's very linked to this issue of consumer or customer protection. And going back to what Magnus said earlier, it's also about being intentional not to exacerbate this digital divide that we can already sort of predict that could happen just at the speed and the scale at which digital payments are happening. So before I go into the risks, I also just wanted to say that on the positive note, it's really been great to see the surge. And that surge is really, testimony to the recognition that businesses, governments, everyone has on the fact that digital payments are really quick, they're efficient, they're transparent, and these things have never been more important than in a time like a crisis. And going back to the risks, I just wanted to also say that this was something that we brought together, or we worked together on with our colleagues from a couple of other development agencies that were convened by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. These include the Center for Global Development, the Innovations for Poverty Action, Queen Maxima's team, as well as the World Food Programme. And the objective was really to kind of identify risks in delivering COVID-19 digital transfers from a social protection perspective, but these risks also apply to any digital payments that we're seeing. And the second objective was really to adapt and recognize some good practices that we are seeing globally, along with our own prior work on responsible practices. This is through the Responsible Digital Payment Guidelines, which was issued first in 2016. So there are seven key risks that we identified. I don't want to go, in the interest of time, I don't want to go through all of them, but just to say that these are all discussed in a very comprehensive document that's being made public and, offers key recommendations for regulators, digital financial service providers, as well as owners of digital transfer programs. And we do need to look at a variety of actors because it requires a coordinated, concerted sort of effort to solve these risks. So, in the interest of time, I would like to focus on the first risk, which we also think is the most important risk, and that's the one around actually making available or the inadequacy of complaints and feedback and grievance redressal mechanisms that we have seen in a lot of programs that are being implemented. And we see, a prioritization of addressing this risk could also help to address some of the other 6 risks that we discussed. So when we look at digital payments, the burden of solving issues is unfortunately skewed towards the beneficiary of the client, right? Most regulators, yes, require the existence of some sort of recourse system, but we do think that more collaboration opportunities exist to actually define the criteria better, the quality and the accessibility of these recourse mechanisms. And that's what we're trying to do with this snapshot that we're put together. So when we talk about recourse and the burden on the customer, so for example, when you talk about a woman who's working in a factory in Indonesia, she receives a notice of her wage payment via, her mobile phone, but the amount that the bank agent outside a factory gives her does not appear to be correct. Who should she talk to? Is it the digital financial service provider? Is it the agent? Is it the boss at her factory? And this sort of, scenario is all too common for the many recipients of digital payments across the world, and the resulting confusion, frustration can actually result in a derailment of efforts that we are all trying to make towards the transition from cash to digital. So, just to conclude, I've said a little bit about what regulators are already traditionally doing. This document or this small bit of research also puts together recommendations for digital financial service providers, as well as program owners of digital transfer schemes, to also stress that both these actors also have a key role to play in customer protection, and both of them can also be responsible in their efforts to ensure customer protection. So for the DFS, or for the digital financial service providers, it's about really integrating grievance redressal and recording and monitoring grievance redressal as part of your key performance indicators. For example, to be more inclusive, it's also about having dedicated women operators or operators trained in gender sensitivity, because we know that DFS could be more of a struggle for women users. Moving on to digital transfer programs, who then typically rely on their digital financial service providers to ensure that customer protection is ensured. It's also about being more intentional in setting some of these requirements, defining responsibility for real-time redressal and solutions, monitoring the feedback and complaints, prioritizing them, and using this information and this data collected to then actively bridge that gap in understanding and address the key grievances that keep coming up. So with that, I just want to say, I urge everyone to look out for this document, which discusses, the 7 broader risks, as well as the recommended actions in greater detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Isvary. I think it's important that we that we do consider along this this journey, certainly the recovery, the risks, and how we can protect those players in the ecosystem and new risks that present themselves. So I'd like to have a last question for Magnus. Based on your experience over the last year and what you've observed amongst your customers and particularly the suppliers, which ones were better able to adapt to these dramatic changes brought about by the pandemic? And then this is a question for you, Magnus, but others might wish also to respond to afterwards. How could industry groups, government stakeholders, or development organizations like ADB better prepare themselves for this kind of unexpected crisis like we're experiencing now? Although I hope, as was said, this is once in a century, or someone mentioned, but how could these different stakeholders better support the adaptation or changing to these new platforms?
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you for the trust in trying to answer the second question. I think that's a big one. But to start perhaps with the first part, I think what has really become very clear to us is, irrespective if we look at MSMEs, SMEs, also larger companies, as well as end users and consumers, I think everyone has adopted tremendously well under the circumstances and the often extremely difficult circumstances that this year has put upon us. And I think that's a very, very important and also positive starting point. I think that when it comes to what it takes for companies to digitalize and what it takes for an SME to sort of start using online tools, I think let's not make it too complicated. It doesn't need to be that difficult as such, especially not to get started. I think we can take it really as a step-by-step journey. We can start on a quite simple, basic level to open a store online. All you need is your phone, really, to start selling beyond your neighborhood or wherever you have your business established. Over time, that can grow, and there is no sort of limit to the extent of how much technology can be used to transform any business. But I think to not make it too complicated to get started. And I think also a little bit into your second question, to get prepared, I think what we try to do on our side and within Lazada and the company is to talk in some ways less about the crisis. I think that because we tend to get a little bit distracted, but more look at what do we need to do from here and going forward. And I think that we continue to be optimistic about where we are. I think that is a very, very important starting point. And I think that what has been laid bare in this crisis, I think, is that we have never had an as active dialogue with government stakeholders in all of our markets as we've had over the past 6 months. I think that's a very, very good and positive starting point. I think we have talked about everything from what we need to do on supply chain, what we need to do on, as I mentioned before, digital identities and so on, what we need to do in terms of making, when we talk about financing, how do we make data available so that we can do appropriate credit scoring without charging unnecessarily high interest rates and so on, right? And I think that the list goes on. And what I really hope for looking from here and into the future is that we continue this dialogue, that we don't stop here, because to build and also when we talk about how do we enable exports, how do we enable education, no one can tackle this problem on their own. It's really about teamwork from everyone who is a either large company, small company, government stakeholder, or development organizations, who I really do believe have been also an important catalyst for many of these conversations to work together as we look ahead. But to really do that in the spirit of that the years to come presents a tremendously exciting opportunity, and it's really up to us what we make of it.
This is great. Thank you, Magnus. And especially because I'm looking at some of the questions that we've, if we're moving now to the audience Q&A, we received 2 questions from Zarex Robus, and I think you started to answer a few of these, which I think is quite useful, and I'd like to hear from maybe some of the other panelists. But the first question was, what are the key driver takeaways for a company to adopt digital solutions in order to compete in the growing digital ecosystem post-COVID. And I think, Magnus, you mentioned, for really, if you start with the very basics, it's a phone, it's a mobile phone. And I think the next basic would obviously be connectivity of some type. So that does present a challenge in some areas, but usually there's some place to go to get connectivity, even if it's not right in your home, as in I don't have connectivity, cell phone connectivity in my home office. I have internet, and then I go outside and I have cell phone but not internet. So it's a challenge. And then the next question that we have is, while the impetus to digital solutions are the path forward post-COVID and beyond, how are Southeast Asian countries coping with the requirement of digital infrastructure, which we also touched on? Can you cite current projects involving public-private partnerships for digital solution projects? So I think this really also touches on what you mentioned of we can't do this alone, that it is partnerships, and I think that it's going to become more important going forward. I'd like to go ahead. Are there any panelists that would like to address either of these questions? I think. Maybe JoJo, would you maybe talk about the infrastructure issue in terms of the work that you're doing?
Well, yeah, the infrastructure issue will remain to be an infrastructure issue. Depending, because it's been taken as a commercial. It's right now in the Philippines. I think the provision of the data infrastructure by two telecommunications companies basically reaching a point wherein there's going to be massive cooperation, collaboration, especially what's coming out of COVID. But I'd like to focus more on the statement that how do you get into this competing ecosystem, right? So I don't believe we have to take a look at some companies competing for the same customer, or competing for a community of customers or consumers, because I think there's really a lot of people that we can impact, that you can help improve their lives through this digital transformation. And it's maybe Magnus will attest to the fact that this has also brought out hundreds or thousands and thousands of new entrepreneurs, right? Entrepreneurs, cooking food at home, and now all of a sudden giving them into sharing that in the community. And then in some of the underbanked or underprivileged markets that I've seen, there's a lot of businesses in laundry. Some of these mothers who are not doing anything, all of a sudden they have access to saying that they can also take in laundry services for some of the people in the communities. I think this is what we should really focus on. Focus on identifying what are the really value-added services that can come out positively from this, and then we will realize that there's a lot of needs that can be addressed through this. And the biggest mistake we will commit is that we become very happy with the surge of digitization, when this is only coming from people who are already digitized in the first place, right? So when you see 87% or 2,000% increase in transactions in GCash, in PayMaya, when you look into that, these are the same bank customers that are now basically doing all of these transactions at home. But where are the transactions coming from? Those underprivileged, one who may not have access to the same broadband spectrum that the people on the top of the pyramid are getting. So I think those are the things that everybody else, government and private sector, should start looking into. Fortunately for us, as part of this group, again, we're playing within our ecosystem, wherein we have a spectrum of customers, from SMEs, MSMEs, to real consumers, to employees, to factory workers. And so, we're able to come up with understanding their needs in the new normal. And hopefully, through our own initiatives, we're able to use digitization as a means by which we can bring them positively into the next realm of economic turnaround most probably, right? So that's my insights in answering that particular question on competing ecosystems. Yeah.
So thank you, JoJo. I'm interested, if you don't mind, if I turn to you, Deanna, from a gender perspective. Do you have any thoughts on, the adopting these basic digital solutions, moving businesses online, or even the roles that public and private sector can come together to support greater participation from women?
Yeah, thank you. I would say a few things actually regarding the public-private aspect. It's interesting because, we keep talking about the digital divide and the bottom 40 and how we're going to kind of merge that and provide the services for people at the last mile. Sorry, it's not on women. I have the next point is on women, but I think the first point is really bridging that digital divide, and that does require public-private partnership. Regarding the data aspect, and this is where I feel like it's more critical than ever to be able to have access to this data. We were talking about open banking solutions, and for women particularly, what we've been working on in the past through our challenge funds and through the different, it's not really public-private, it's more blended finance approach, is providing risk capital to fintech providers to be able to develop tailored solutions for women as individuals or women entrepreneurs, to really identify, what are those kind of nuanced challenges that women entrepreneurs are specifically facing in onboarding them, not only in terms of access, but also usage of financial services. And I think that's where data really comes in. If we have access to, very specific data, I think Magnus was also mentioning this, developing very specialized types of products and services that meet those demands of clients. And women do have unique demands, particularly in terms of access to credit, the bankability of their proposals. Sometimes they're informal enterprises. They might not necessarily have formal accounting systems. Being able to, use
Okay, so this I think is very apt because we're experiencing the challenges of digital connectivity, and I think it's not even the digital divide. These are those of us who are better equipped with the tools to connect. But what I wanted to ask about was particularly this idea of the dialogue. Magnus mentioned that there's been even increased dialogue between government stakeholders and private sector during the pandemic to come up with solutions and look at recovery. So I'm curious, Magnus, if you don't mind me asking, what kinds of venues or channels are you using to engage in that dialogue, and what are some ways that we can help sustain that?
Thank you, Kelly. I think that this is a topic that of course, we are looking at different, should we say, avenues or domains of issues that needs to be tackled. On the one hand, you can have, when we look at stimulation or how we can stimulate the retail economy, I think I would look to Malaysia, for example, where the Malaysian government has taken quite forward-looking effort to stimulate consumer demand as one of these ways. If you look to Singapore, for example, I think there was ongoing discussions on food supply, things like how do we ensure that we can secure the food supply chain, and what role we can play in that in that regard, right? When you look to other markets, I think especially in Philippines and Indonesia, I think there we have been more, I would say, forward-looking in the thinking, and I think that's also consistent with the approach that the governments have taken to look sort of beyond the crisis and what needs to be put in place to enable SMEs. And I think again that the focus on how we enable SMEs both to find new markets, either that is new markets domestically where online can be a tool to get into a new market, or to find that through export and sort of what it takes for companies to go from serving a smaller market to ASEAN, to China or beyond, and so on, right? And I think that some of these topics, it will take time to see results. But what I would say when it comes to the more complex issues, identities, privacy, data, how we look at data localization in the context of cloud and so on, I think this is where the discussions need more facilitation. It's not just about sort of a dialogue, we do this and you're underway. It's where we need to think together. We need to have expertise on the topics. We need to make sure that multiple opinions come up on the table. And I think especially with regards to those areas, this is really where I would look very much to the development organizations to help both the governments as well as the private sector on that journey.
Great, thank you. So I do think, events such as this that we're engaging in right now, this is a good opportunity to bring forward some new views and ideas, and to look at where are the opportunities for further dialogue. Isvary, if I could just turn to you also for the working group that you've been engaged in. How do you see that helping to inform the longer term vision?
So yes, this working group is actually a public-private working group that we have helped to convene in the Philippines, but it's really led by BSP as well as DTI, given that the focus is on promoting the use and adoption of responsible digital payments by consumers, as well as the corresponding acceptance by the micro and small merchant segment. And, I think when we talk about digital divide, looking at adoption barriers, we know from the Philippines diagnostic that was, the digital payments diagnostic that was released last December, that, P2B, which is people to business payments, have a huge potential to drive overall volumes of digital payments in the Philippines, and it's still, not quite reaching that potential. So that was really the objective of bringing this group together. As I said, it's being led by BSP and DTI, but we also have Lazada as one of our key private sector members on the group, bringing in, this whole perspective around how do we also drive digital payments on these e-commerce platforms? I think Deanna mentioned earlier that, in Southeast Asia, and this is across Southeast Asia, we still see largely this phenomenon of cash on delivery. And to your point or question earlier, Kelly, about how do we also measure impact of such convening and of such dialogue? I think through this group, we really want to also identify and agree on some actor-specific actions. And there are a whole bunch of recommendations and possibility of actions that can happen. But I think this dialogue from the perspective of the government is also to get feedback, obviously, from the private sector stakeholders, but also, to decide on prioritization of these actions. To talk about which one is actually going to, enable the result quicker. And because this work is in parallel with the diagnostic piece that BSP is leading and continuing to drive, it will be possible to actually track progress because the diagnostic looks at digital payments from the perspective of specific use cases, and people to business use cases is one. The use case is one big one.
Great, thank you. And with 5 minutes to go till we conclude our session, I have there's so much material for me to sum up and have as key takeaways. I thought that I would throw it over to you, the panelists, for sort of your last thoughts on your key takeaway before I wrap up. Deanna, could you give your one one or two statement wrap up?
Sure, I'll give you some bullet points from my side. I think the things that came out for me is ensuring an enabling regulatory environment, particularly allowing for open banking. The digital divide was something we've discussed multiple times, and finding ways to enable digital accessibility, not only in terms of infrastructure, but I think one thing we didn't talk about was also in terms of skills. So ensuring that onboarding of people, if they have the digital access, but also they have the skills to use it. And also in terms of coordination, you know, us as UN, you guys as ADB and others, you know, we are coordinating agencies between the public sector, but also in some senses the private sector and public sector too. So this is, I think, our role in taking forward some of these dialogues and being able to kind of bridge the communications channels. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Joyce, what is your key takeaway? For our audience, which is made up primarily of government regulators and private sector, by the way.
Yeah, I think the panel discussion really highlighted that we need to, do a deliberate and coordinated approach to ensure that the benefits, the promised benefits of the digital transition, of the digital economy are distributed evenly. So that takes collaboration between the government, private sector, and the donor communities. But aside from that, what was also highlighted in the session is, as more individuals are retrenched because of the pandemic, we will see more young people going into informal businesses, going into starting their own small businesses. And for this, we really need to promote innovative financing, leveraging on, use of data, responsible use of data to make sure that they can access affordable and responsible credit from various sources. So credit is very important. Access to credit through data is very critical moving forward, given the landscape that we're currently in. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, Joyce. JoJo, what's your parting words?
Yes, I think the public-private collaboration to see us through these challenges and then allow us to get into really brighter scenario for a digitized economy. It's important to really maximize the areas of collaboration. As I mentioned earlier, some of the big conglomerates, big companies might have been successful in implementing their own, recovery processes using digital processes or through their own digital transformation journeys. And probably this is something that they can share, so that they share where they fail, they share where they are succeeding, and share that with the rest of the the conglomerates, or even with the government and the public sector. Because I think that, if we go through all of this and we think that we're successful, but the needle did not move on the poverty levels, on the unbanked, on the improvement of the lives of, majority of the population, I think we would have failed. So I think we should focus on the impact, focus on, the value proposition and the services that we really need to digitize, so that, we are really able to move move the needle, even just for a bit. And so that we can talk about success in that manner.
Thank you, and I just would add for that key takeaway that if there are resources that and we have plans and targets, that we do prioritize those who need it the most, those who are most excluded and who really have been most negatively impacted by the pandemic. Isvary, could you please share some parting words?
Sure. So I just wanted to say that, I think there were many relevant points raised, and, this point around not exacerbating the digital divide is probably the one closest to my heart, and, being part of an international development organization. And JoJo rightly pointed out that when we look at just the numbers, it's a reflection of people who maybe already have the access and the ability to use and benefit from these. But I think we can't deny that because of this crisis and because of, just large scale of social transfers, which increasingly and globally have been digitally transferred. There's been a huge onboarding of new customers also onto digital platforms. And as first-time users, there are definitely going to be risks. And there's a role for different types of actors to play a part in being responsible to mitigate those risks. So it's not only for regulators to enforce it. I think there's also room for financial service providers. There's also room for companies that are digitizing their payroll. There's also room for FMCG corporates who are trying to digitize payments by their last mile retailers to ensure responsibility in this whole payments value chain.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And the last words for our wrap up, Magnus.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you all to all the fellow panelists for this very interesting discussion. I think that one of my own takeaways, I think what Deanna was talking about when it comes to the role or the challenges that female entrepreneurs face, as not limiting to female entrepreneurs per se, but the challenges for groups who are should we say, who already face other challenges in their daily lives, and I think that how we really recognize these situations more than what we perhaps are currently doing. I think that is to really remember that everyday life is something I think that can't be emphasized enough. The last point I would make also, when we talk a lot about technology, we have many terms that comes to use and so on. Let's just try to keep it quite simple. Ultimately, things are as complicated as the everyday lives for consumers, for businesses, for ordinary people. That it's not more complicated than that. And I think also when we look at how do we invest into companies, or which companies get access to funding and so on, you don't need to be, should we say, with a top degree in computer science in order to become an entrepreneur in 2020. Quite the opposite. And I really hope that everyone who is a part of the ecosystem plays a part in that development.
Well, thank you. I think you all summarized the discussion in the session brilliantly, even better than I could. So thank you all so much for participating this afternoon, for doing the work that you do. You all play a very important role in the ongoing transformation of the digital economy, but also through the recovery. We need to make sure that we make efforts to ensure that everyone is included, that we keep it simple, and that I think also, as we're looking for the immediate solutions, we keep in view the long-term goals as well. So I want to thank you all again. I thank the participants for joining from across the region and across the globe. And just in concluding, I hope that we can also continue this kind of dialogue, because I find it very beneficial. There's some really important pieces that I've taken away myself to apply in my own work. But I wish you all good health and continued commitment and success in achieving our common goal to create strong national, regional economies where everyone can benefit. So thank you all so much. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.